Some of you guys may be aware of it or may have heard of it. There was a significant mutiny in the French army in 1917. And in a way that hasn't really been repeated many other places in history. We don't normally see like a whole mutiny of an army. And so I thought the background of that is interesting and just worth discussing for a few minutes since we're driving and you can't get away from me. What basically happened is in 1916, the focus of World War I for the French was Verdun. This is the battle that they cannot afford to lose. They throw hundreds of thousands of men into it. And in fact, what they do is, in order to prevent the army from completely collapsing at Verdun, they institute a program of rotation, where units will go into the Verdun front, they'll fight for a brief period, and then they'll rotate out. The Germans are much closer to, well, frankly, to what they would do in World War II as well, where German units kind of go into Verdun, and then they just stay there until they're all dead. Not quite to that extreme, but because of the French rotational system, 3/4 of the French army fought at Verdun. Not constantly, but of the 340 divisions in the French army, 260 some saw action at Verdun. So it really was this collective experience of the entire army and by extension the entire nation. Now, by the fall of 1916, the French have won at Verdun. They've recaptured the major territory. Those two forts that we saw yesterday that fell to the Germans, the French recapture them by the fall of 1917. And one of the guys who's instrumental in that, the commander in that area, is a guy named Nivelle. And so the next thing that has to happen, we've got the height of the winter where there's not going to be a whole lot going on. The weather doesn't permit much real activity. But everyone knows in the spring comes the next offensive. And you have an interesting political situation in France where the government of France is elected. And they are always responsive or have to be responsive to the population. And you have a situation where the Germans occupy France. And this is, of course, the fault of the government. So if you're in the opposition party in France, you have a really easy political play. It's, you should elect me because I'll kick the Germans out, which the current guys have not been able to do. Note that the Germans are still here. So the French political system has this imperative to always be working to get the Germans out of the country. There has to be an offensive. And in the aftermath of Verdun, they're trying to figure out how do we do this. And Nivelle, the commander at Verdun, the hero of Verdun, he thinks he has figured out the way to make this happen. We came up with this formula at Verdun. We're going to have creeping artillery barrages, heavy ones, small unit tactics that we have the infantry are able to follow closely behind this continuous artillery. They're able to assault and overwhelm small German positions and take ground, and this works, and it's the formula. And he is supremely confident that he will be able to use this to exploit, to break through the German lines, which has always been the thing in this war. Once it settles into a stalemate, we have to get through the lines, and then we'll be in open terrain and we can move fast and push the Germans completely out. So he is a serious self-advocate. He makes a very strong case to the French government that I've done it at Verdun, I know how this will happen. Give me control of the army and we'll make a major offensive in 1917 and we will win once and for all. And the French government does it. The British government supports him because the British Prime Minister, the new British Prime Minister Lloyd George, doesn't trust his own generals, Haig, who's kind of an idiot. And in order to, the British Prime Minister doesn't have the political power to kick out his general. But what he is able to do is kind of support the French plan instead and bypass what Haig wants to do, which will happen later and will, of course, be another horrible massacre. So, Nivelle sets his offensive. It's at a place called Chemin des Dames, and this is fairly widely publicized. When the Germans attacked at Verdun, it was a very secret plan. This one's not quite so secret, and it's built up quite a bit in the French populace and the French army. This is the final offensive. We're going to win, and they take off, and the problem is, over the winter, the Germans have also learned from Verdun, and they've changed their tactics. And now the Germans are using this strategy of defense in depth, where they'll have multiple trench lines supporting each other, substantial differences, substantially, far distances apart. And we actually saw this a couple days ago. where when the Americans were taking that hill, they took positions on the front side of the hill the first day and thought they had captured the position. Well, it turns out the Germans had a line on the front of the hill, and then they had a more substantial line on the back of the hill, and then they had more guys in a line behind that. Well, that's what the Germans have adopted, and when the French attack at Chemin des Dames, they do what they think is going to be the winning strategy. It's massive artillery bombardment on the German front line. Well, the problem is the Germans see this coming, and they simply move back to their second line, and the French artillery pounds the bejesus out of the German front line, which has 0 Germans in it.
Brutal.
And by the time the French infantry get there, the Germans have come back and remanned all the positions, and it's a horrific massacre. So, this is one of those things where you hear about World War I, and it's like they always seem to be doing the exact same thing. Didn't they ever learn? Well, the problem is they were both learning simultaneously, and both sides were trying to change and improve. And so in this case, the Germans improve better than the French do, and that's why this turns into another incident that's just as bad as the ones that have come before. Now, the bigger problem here is that this isn't 1914 or 1915. People are getting really seriously weary of this war and these continued horrible bloodbaths. And this leads to the mutinies in the French army. They look at this and they say, this is insanity. We're being asked to go over the top and march directly into German machine gun fire, and it's just suicide. And all the more you hype up the hope of this new offensive, the more of a crushing blow to morale it's going to be when it fails utterly. And by the beginning of May 1917, May 3rd, 1917, there is the first serious incident of mutiny, what they, as we've been told, what they call collective indiscipline. And it is an entire division that is ordered to go over the top and attack, and the soldiers kind of get together, and they confer, and then they approach their officers, and they say, we're not doing it. It's stupid, we're not doing it. The officer corps responds fairly quickly. They round up the leaders. They have a few of them executed. They throw a bunch of them in prison. 2 days later, the division does in fact go over the top, and they are in fact slaughtered. Over the course of May and June of 1917, there would be a total of about 250 of these incidents of collective indiscipline, ranging from small units to fairly large ones. But in general, what's happening is troops are willing to defend. They're not leaving the lines, but they're saying we're not going to participate in these insane, suicidal marches into machine gun fire. We're just not doing it. Now, there are a few of them that become a little more serious. There are at least 1 or 2 of smaller units, like company-sized units, 100, 200 guys, who decide to try and grab some trucks and raid the armory and launch, set up their own governments in little areas, set up little communes, attack the headquarters. There's a lot less of that. Most of the mutiny are troops who are simply refusing to attack. They will hold. They're not fans of the Germans, but they're also not fans of needless sacrifice. And the French overall commander recognizes, he's a smart enough guy that he understands kind of what's going on. He recognizes that this is a serious morale problem, and he has to actually identify with the troops and show them that, look, the high command is not just a bunch of aristocrats sitting in a chateau throwing men into German guns. And this had kind of been the setup of the French army. There was a permanent officer corps that was an aristocratic elite, and then the French army itself is a huge conscript force. And the two didn't really trust each other. You had substantial social and cultural differences between the two. But what the army does in response to these mutinies, they arrest a lot of guys. They execute only a few. I believe it was 55 men were actually executed in total out of 35,000 who participated in one way or another in the mutinies. And the French army responds, so that's the stick that they respond with, is if you don't do what we tell you, we're going to put you in prison or execute you, as an example. But they also respond with carrots. And so the generals tour the line, Foch specifically. They improve the food and the rations for the French soldiers. They improve the living conditions in the trenches. Throughout the war, the Germans always pretty much have better trenches. The Germans are on the defensive. So the Germans have met a lot of their goals. They're here in France. It's enemy territory, and they've captured it. And all they have to do to win is stay here. And so the Germans tend to build fairly elaborate fortifications. They plan on staying here. They're going to dig deep bunkers. They're going to run electricity. They're going to have some creature comforts for the troops who are expected to stay here. The French kind of do the opposite. The French, it's not good enough for the French to stay in their trenches. They have to move forward. They have to clear Germans out of France. And so they kind of keep this general attitude of, we're not going to be in these trenches long. Don't let them become comfortable, or maybe the troops will stay in them. So life in the trenches sucks everywhere. It really sucks in the French trenches. And that's something that's addressed in the aftermath, in the spring and summer, well, the summer of 1917. The food gets better, the living conditions get better. They institute a program of leave for the soldiers so they can actually take a week at a time and go home and visit their families. Let's see, the military legal system is somewhat reformed. They're given legitimate, very real assurances and reforms that you won't, if you are charged with a court, we call it a court-martialable offense, you will actually be given a trial. You'll actually be able to present your own defense in ways that maybe hadn't been the case before. There won't be, just rough justice. Someone said that you disobeyed an officer, so you're up against a wall, bam, you're shot at the end. No, you'll now be able to present a defense. You'll get a fair hearing. And most importantly, probably, we'll stop making these attacks. And I think part of that was the Americans have joined the war as of April. And we're talking May, June, July here. You know what? Maybe we can just... I suspect the subtext was, we'll let the Americans march into the German machine guns, and we'll go clean up after. I'm not aware of them actually really saying that, but I suspect
it was.
That's what's up here.
Yeah, if I was in that position, that's what I'd be planning. Like, all right, I've done this. Now it's someone else's turn.
That's some fresh legs.
Yeah. And so by July, the mutinies were over. Like I said, there were a total of about 250 individual incidents. It scared the shit out of the French high command because there was no centralized, coordinated leadership of this movement. It really was a grassroots morale problem, and it would pop up unpredictably. Some units, it would pop up in a fairly mundane way. Some would be fairly extreme. The concern, of course, was that this was going to turn into a communist revolution like it happened or was happening in Russia. And the army would simply completely revolt. And that never happened. It is interesting that when the Germans got wind of this, first off, the French were able to keep it under wraps well enough that the Germans never found out in a way that they were able to use it to their advantage and attack in some sector where the French troops were mutinying. When the Germans did find out, their response was to institute an hour a day of patriotic lecture or patriotic training. Basically, their response wasn't, let's take advantage of this and attack. Their response was, oh shit, I wonder if this is going to happen to us too. Because our army's really not very far from being in this same place. We've been doing all the same things.
Yes.
So, to the best of my knowledge, it never did happen in the German army. But their response was like, uh-oh, let's squash this before it starts.